One of our tools for studying inheritance is a pedigree. A pedigree is essentially a family tree that shows the history of all of the individuals that express either form of the gene that you're looking for. And you use a pedigree to help you determine the inheritance pattern. And the reason that we do this, we generally do this with humans, although you could do it with pretty much anything. Generally, we do this with humans because we are not selectively breeding humans. Humans are terrible model organisms. If you think back to all of the characteristics we listed for model organisms, humans are terrible for that. And most humans are not going to take kindly to selective breeding to determine inheritance patterns. And so we use this family tree of traits to help us to determine the inheritance pattern that we're looking at. And there are a couple of different patterns that we can look at. One is to look at whether the trait is autosomal, meaning it is one located on one of our autosomes, or sex-linked, meaning that it is located on the X or Y chromosome, although generally we are talking about traits on the X chromosome. And then we'll also want to determine if it is dominant or recessive. So when we look at our different types of traits, we're going to be looking at patterns that are going to tell us the chromosomal location, autosomal or sex-linked, and then the expression pattern, whether it is dominant or recessive. So our pedigree is basically a representation of the inheritance of one or more characteristics. Most of this video is going to cover sort of vocabulary and ways that we look at our pedigrees. The first thing that we want to know is who we are discussing. So usually somebody presents with a particular disorder, and we want to know how they inherited that pattern. So that person, the first person, or the person who is trying to determine the pattern, is called the proband. And this is usually listed as a P on the pedigree, sometimes with a little arrow, or a P in the center. This is just saying this is the person in question. So maybe it's a child that was recently born and the family wants to know how they inherited this particular trait. Another term that we use often with pedigrees is consanguineous. Basically, this means close blood relations. So one of the best ways to determine the inheritance pattern is to look at what happens when we have families where close relatives have had offspring. And the reason that we do this is because it sort of concentrates a trait within a particular family. When we have consanguineous relationships, they tend to increase the frequency of a recessive trait, and those traits become more common. So this could be in a small family, it could be in a small community, or it could kind of be in a isolated, larger community. This diagram shows some of the common representations that you'll see on a pedigree. Females are represented by a circle, males square, and if we don't know the biological sex of the person, we use a square turned on its side or a diamond shape. A filled in circle or square means affected. And what I want you all to remember is that you are looking at the affected individual to determine the inheritance pattern. We do not assume that affected means dominant or affected means recessive. You have to look at it the other way and look at the pattern to determine if those affected have a dominant trait or a recessive trait. And I would say that is the most common mistake that I see students make, is that they make an assumption and then try to determine the pattern. And we really want to look at the pattern first. And I think this comes from the fact that most of our examples that we use for affected disorders, such as albinism, sickle cell anemia, those are all recessive. And so we talk about the recessives more frequently. Affected also does not have to be a disease. It could just mean that they have a particular trait that they are displaying it. So it doesn't have to be a disease or a negative trait. It doesn't have to be a mutation. We may see individuals connected by a line in the center. This means it could mean that they were married. It could just mean that they have children together. And then a line coming down is going to represent all of their offspring. If we've got a double bar in the center, that indicates a close relationship. So maybe these two are cousins or something like that. Children are listed in their birth order from left to right. So these two individuals have a child, child 1, child 2, child 3. This one on the left is going to be the oldest, and then go down from there. If we have multiples in a row, so let's say that they had an older boy, an older girl, and then 4 sons all with the same phenotype, then we have the number in there that just indicates it. A split from 2 parents indicates twins. And then if we have the bar in between, that's going to indicate identical twins or monozygotic. And those guys, because they're monozygotic, always have the same sex. We've got our proband notation here, first individual or the one under study. If there is a line through the circle or the square, it means they are deceased. And sometimes we will see a dot in the center, which means they are heterozygous and carriers. We will often see the generation listed as Roman numerals and then individuals numbered. So this is the parental generation here, generation 1, mom and dad, generation 2, son, daughter, daughter, going along in that line. We might see some other less common notations. Ours are in this class are usually generally pretty straightforward. We see an adoption bracket here. This means that these are the biological parents on this side and they were adopted by these parents. Of course, that would mean that we're not getting genetic inheritance to this individual here from the parents that were raising them. Down at the bottom, this is an example of cousins. So this is grandparents, brother and sister, and then their children have a relationship usually that means there's an offspring of some sort there. So that's just how we might see that consanguinity. So we're going to look at the different types of inheritance patterns. You may remember from Biology 101 that when you do pedigrees, you look at sex-linked and autosomal at the same time. Our textbook actually splits those up. So we're really going to focus on autosomal, but I am going to talk about how you recognize that they are autosomal. When you look at a pedigree, the first thing you're going to want to do is look at the chromosomal type inheritance. In other words, is it an autosomal trait or is it a sex-linked trait? Now, the trick here is remembering that in an autosomal trait, males and females are affected at the same rate. So basically, if we have the same number of males and females, affected, then we know that it is present on one of our autosomes. We're not going into the reason at the moment, but for sex-linked traits are more common in males. And if you don't remember why at the moment, that's okay. We'll get to it a little bit later. I think we get to it in chapter 4. A sex-linked trait appears more frequently in males because they have only one X chromosome. And when we say sex-linked, we really mean X-linked, a trait that is on an X chromosome. We can absolutely talk about Y-linked. We'll talk about that later, but when we're using pedigrees, it's almost always going to be X-linked. So we're going to look for one of those two things. Is it more common in males, or are there roughly the same number of males and females? If we see more females, it means it's autosomal because sex-linked is more common in males. So in this pedigree here, we have one affected male, one affected female. That doesn't really tell us a ton, but I'm just going to tell you this one, it is an autosomal. So then we need to determine if it is recessive or dominant. The number one way to determine if it's recessive is if you have two unaffected parents with an affected child. So I usually tell students to look for the affected. Remember, we're not assuming that they're dominant or recessive. Find an affected individual and look at their parents, and do that for each one. And if you find an individual where they have an unaffected parents but an affected child, you know automatically that this is a recessive trait, because this can't happen if it is an autosomal dominant. So what this means is that the parents are hiding the trait in the heterozygous state, and they are passing on the recessive alleles to their child. So the parents are hiding it, but the children are displaying it. And then we see it down here as well. We see these two individuals with an affected child. Again, that means that the parents had to have it in the recessive form and then pass it on to their child. You may be asked to fill in any number of individual genotypes. You should write all of the possibles. So this individual, once we determine this is an autosomal recessive, we know that every affected individual is going to be homozygous recessive. For the other individuals, if we look at the parents, we have heterozygotes. That means these individuals could be homozygous or heterozygous. And you may be able to rule out one or the other if you have information on their children as well. So for example, we know that these two individuals must be heterozygous because they have to pass on the recessive to their children. And we could work through and figure out the other individuals as well and as requested. So here we have a pedigree example for albinism. Albinism is an autosomal recessive trait. And this just tells you a little bit about what you're seeing for the phenotype. So we have our proband here at the bottom, the individual that presented with albinism, and maybe this family wants to know where this trait came from. So if we look at this individual, we immediately see that we have two unaffected parents with an affected child. This is going to tell us that it is recessive. This one happens to be autosomal as well. This pedigree doesn't have really enough individuals to be able to determine if it's sex-linked or not. And we'll talk a little bit later about some more indicators of sex-linked versus autosomal. Another thing you can look for is if their traits skip a generation. So this does not mean that there is a generation necessarily where nobody has it. But if we look in direct line of descendants, so grandparents, parents, children, that's where we're looking for the skipping. And here we see a skip where neither of these parents have it, but one of their parents does, or maybe the other as well, depending on the trait, and then the children have it. So we're not looking for entire generations, but we are looking for a straight line descendant. I would say not to look for skipping every single time, because you might have a situation where you don't have two unaffected parents. Maybe you have all affected and you just don't see it being hidden. So you can't always assume based on a skipping if there is no skipping, you can't assume that it is dominant either. So I always tell students just look for this 2 affected parents with an unaffected child. I'm sorry, 2 unaffected parents with an affected child. Next, we have our autosomal dominant. So again, we're going to check for autosomal based on the number of individuals in the pedigree that are affected. So here we have 5 females and 4 males. This is going to be roughly equal affectedness. So we have autosomal. So they are equally affected. And then for dominant, generally, dominance is going to appear in every generation. But I ask students, instead of saying it doesn't skip or it appears in every generation, what I want you to look at is where does each child get the trait? So if we start down here at number 5, this individual got it from an affected parent. This individual got it from an unaffected parent. This one from an affected parent. Every affected child has an affected parent. And that's what I asked students to look for. Where do they get the trait? They get it from their affected parent. The other thing that we can look for, and I actually don't know that I see one in this particular pedigree, is the opposite of our recessive. And this is where we have 2 affected parents and an unaffected child. So this only happens if the parents are expressing a dominant trait and hiding a recessive. So it's essentially the opposite of the autosomal recessive. 2 affected parents have an unaffected child. And you can use either one to justify your assignment of autosomal dominant. So example here, familial hypercholesterolemia. This is inherited high cholesterol. So this is where the body cannot break down cholesterol and it accumulates at high levels. This is an autosomal dominant. So here we have every affected child has an affected parent. There's no skipping of generations, but I do want to point out that we've got this group here where it does appear to skip or appear to be hidden. Basically, what has happened is that these individuals are all exhibiting the recessive trait. So it does appear to have skipped, which is why I ask students not to rely solely on that and to look at where the children are inheriting from. The remainder of the slides are example pedigrees. I'm going to pause just for a minute and I want you to think about them. Remember that you are looking for autosomal or sex-linked and dominant or recessive. And when you practice this, when you do this in your homework, you're going to have to justify for both of them. So you should have a reason for autosomal or sex-linked and a reason for dominant or recessive. This last one shows X-linked dominance, and I actually meant to cover that. Excuse me, cover the title. X-linked dominant is a little bit harder. It's harder to definitively say that it is X-linked, but there is a pattern that we can look at to determine. So for X-linked dominant, There is not more affected males or females necessarily. The rules for dominance still apply. Every affected child has an affected parent. But in X-linked dominant, we have that males, because males pass on an X chromosome, males pass on to daughters, but never to sons. All right, so females can pass to either. So this mom has passed to her daughter, this mom has passed to her son. So females pass to either. But if we look at the male here, he only passes to his daughter. And so X-linked dominant is a little bit harder to identify. You have to look really closely at who is inheriting the trait from whom.